The morning had started like so many others. I opened the shutters to let in the May light, with that warm sun that gilds the facades of Philadelphia. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as I sat at my usual round table, the one I've kept since Donovan was a child. I glanced at the calendar hanging on the wall, Mother's Day. I picked up the phone intending to confirm the plans. I hadn't heard anything all week, but I figured it was due to last-minute busyness. I texted Harlow a brief and polite message. "Good morning. Harlow, what time are we meeting today?" Less than a minute later, the screen lit up with her response. "Oops, we forgot. We went to Cape May, just the ones who really matter." I felt the air catch in my chest. I read and reread those words, as if part of me hoped to find a hidden nuance, a poorly phrased joke. There wasn't. The phrase was clear, devoid of double meanings. They were there. My son, my daughter-in-law, and the explicit exclusion of my name and my place. I gripped the mug with both hands, more to find an anchor than for the warmth. The echo of the ones who really matter repeated in my head, mixing with old images, tables full of food I prepared, candles lit in the dining room, laughter echoing in every corner, all that now seemed part of a borrowed life that had been returned to me without warning. I looked toward the counter where the bouquet of carnations I'd bought myself the day before still sat, thinking perhaps they'd join the celebration at home. The intense red of the flowers suddenly seemed too vibrant for the stillness enveloping me. I took a deep breath, trying to sort through the whirlwind of questions and emotions. I didn't want to respond right away. I knew any words from me in that moment would come out laced with a pain they didn't deserve to see. I slipped the phone into the pocket of my robe and, with mechanical movements, picked up the empty mug. As I turned on the faucet to rinse it, I felt something new, a sting that wasn't sadness. And I understood that this sting would be the one to guide me in the days to come. When I began to see things with different eyes, I stood by the sink, watching the water run without moving a muscle. Harlow's words lingered in my mind, but gradually, they fit into a larger mosaic. I remembered, almost unwillingly, that January afternoon when, with a smile meant to be kind, she said, "Beatrice, sometimes you seem distracted. Are you sure you're not forgetting things?" She tossed it out like commenting on the weather, but it left a bitter aftertaste. It wasn't the only time. On several occasions, at the end of a meal, she'd ask if I wasn't tired, if I wouldn't prefer to rest instead of getting into messes. It was a subtle tone, wrapped in apparent concern, but it started to paint a picture of fragility that I didn't feel. Donovan, for his part, had changed. He used to call me almost daily, even if just to share something trivial. In recent months, his responses to any question were vague. "We'll see. We're looking at dates. Harlow's organizing it." Even when I suggested dinner together on the day that would mark 40 years since my wedding to his father, though he was no longer here, he said he couldn't confirm anything because there were other plans in the works. Other plans that never materialized. The more I reviewed those moments, the more evident it seemed that these weren't simple oversights. There was a sequence, an intention that now, with that morning's message, revealed itself with clarity. It was as if, little by little, they'd been drawing a circle that left me out, justifying it with insinuations about my health or my energy. I returned to the table and moved the bouquet of carnations aside, leaving the center clear. I felt the need for space, for air to think. Something told me that the exclusion on Mother's Day wasn't an isolated incident, but the result of a longer, more calculated strategy. And I knew that, if I wanted to understand it fully, I'd have to start paying attention not just to what they said, but to what they were trying to hide. That afternoon, trying to shake off the feeling of emptiness, I set out to tidy up the house a bit. It always calms me to put everything in its place. It's as if by aligning the objects I could also order my thoughts. I started with the study, which had remained almost untouched since the last time Donovan came to help me with some folders. While dusting the desk, I noticed the wicker wastebasket was fuller than usual. I bent down to empty it and, among the crumpled papers, a piece of a receipt caught my eye. I smoothed it out carefully. It was a hotel bill from an establishment facing the beach in Cape May. The date matched exactly with Mother's Day weekend, and there they were, printed in black ink, the names of Harlow Keene and Donovan Voss. The blow to my stomach was immediate, though I already knew where they'd been, but seeing the names together on an official paper, as registered guests, turned the wound into something physical. What disconcerted me most was finding it there, in my own wastebasket. I kept sifting through the contents and, beneath torn envelopes and advertising flyers, discovered something even more unsettling: photocopies of the deeds to my house, the one I've lived in for 30 years, and copies of my bank statements. They weren't originals, but clear enough for anyone to see the numbers and details. I stayed still, documents in hand, feeling my intuition, until then diffuse, become precise. This wasn't simple clutter. Someone had been reviewing papers that weren't theirs and, through carelessness or overconfidence, had left traces. I placed everything on the desk in a neat pile and sat down to observe it. Each sheet seemed to stare back at me, demanding a reaction. It was no longer just a family snub. There was a line they'd crossed, and I needed to know how far they were willing to go. With that thought in mind, I closed the study door and knew the next step would be to scrutinize my accounts. That same night, I turned on the computer and opened, with feigned calm, the folder where I keep my bank statements. I've always been organized with my finances, but I hadn't reviewed them in detail for months. I started scrolling line by line until a figure made me stop a transfer of $25,000 made to Donovan's name. Just 6 months ago, I felt a knot in my throat. The description said family transfer, and I immediately remembered that Sunday when he arrived with some documents for me to sign. He said it was just a data update at the bank, nothing urgent. We were about to eat together. And I, trusting, didn't read the fine print. I signed while the oven was on and the house smelled of roast. Now I saw clearly what I'd authorized: a direct transfer from my savings account to his. No update. No administrative procedure. It was liquid cash. Enough to cover several years of expenses or, as I'd discover later, to pay for the renovation of Harlow's apartment in Old City. The anger displaced the sadness, as if an inner flame consumed the feeling of helplessness that had accompanied me since morning. I began mentally connecting the dots, the comments about my supposed distraction, Donovan's evasions, the silence on important dates, and now, the trace of money that had left my hands without my real consent. It wasn't just about excluding me from a trip or a family meal. This was a pattern, a way of using me while pushing me aside. And the worst part was that I myself, out of love and trust, had given them the keys. I closed the file, turned off the screen, and stared at my reflection in the window. The indignation had a different weight. It was no longer just a feeling. It was an engine. And I knew the time had come to move stealthily, but decisively. The next day, my first call would be to someone who knew exactly how to protect what was mine. First thing in the morning, I dialed the number of Mr. Victor Langston, my lifelong lawyer. His deep, measured voice greeted me with the familiarity of someone who'd shared decades of trust. I didn't beat around the bush. I explained the transfer to Donovan, the hotel receipt, the photocopies of my deeds, He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Come to the office, Beatrice, right away today," before leaving. I also called Elena Vaughn, my accountant and friend from the years when we both worked at the same company. I summarized the situation, and with the efficiency that had always defined her. She replied, "I'll be there in an hour. We'll get everything up to date and secure yours." In less than a morning, Mr. Victor's office became a command center. Elena brought folders, statements, lists. I brought my personal documents and the determination to tie up every loose end. We moved all possible funds to new accounts, solely in my name. We closed joint accounts, updated beneficiaries on insurance and investment plans, and changed every password like locking bolts before a storm, while signing one last form. Elena looked at me seriously. "Beatrice, if they've started with insinuations about your memory or health, it's likely they want to claim incapacity to handle your assets. If I were you, I'd get a full medical evaluation and guard it like gold." The idea hit me like a blast of cold air. I remembered every time Harlow had dropped, with false concern, that, at my age, it was normal to forget things. I nodded. "Handle the arrangements. Elena, I want an impeccable report." Leaving the office, I felt the weight in my chest lighten. Not because the danger had vanished, but because, for the first time in a long while, I was setting the course. I walked down the street with the certainty that, when they tried to use what they thought was theirs, they'd run into a wall they weren't expecting that afternoon, while preparing a tea. The phone rang with a number I recognized instantly, the Cape May area. The phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the steam rising from my cup of tea. The screen showed Donovan's name, but when I answered, the voice that came through was Harlow's, tense, without a trace of courtesy. "Beatrice, have you done something to the accounts?" she fired, without greeting. "The cards aren't working, and the hotel wants us to pay now." I heard a murmur in the background, like the rhythmic crash of waves and muffled voices. Before replying, I sensed Donovan taking the phone. "Mom, it's not a big deal," he said in a tone meant to be conciliatory. "It was an oversight. Don't think we did it with bad intentions." I took a deep breath, letting my silence impose itself for a few seconds. "Donovan, intentions are measured by actions, and yours speak loud. We didn't want to hurt you," he insisted. "We just forgot to let you know. Let me know that you were going to spend Mother's Day without me, or that you've been moving my money around like it's yours for months." There was no immediate response. I could imagine the uncomfortable glances between them. "Mom," he started again, but I interrupted. "Until you treat me with respect, you won't have access to a single dollar of mine. No cards, no transfers, no favors. And don't call me to negotiate while you're sharing a room with someone who thinks they can decide who matters and who doesn't." On the other end, a thick silence, broken only by the sound of the sea. "This is absurd," Harlow managed to say. But I'd already decided not to keep listening. I hung up with a calm gesture, like closing a door that had been open too long. I stayed a moment with the phone in hand, listening to the echo of my own determination. I set the device on the table, took a sip of my now lukewarm tea, and thought they wouldn't be long in returning to Philadelphia, seeking explanations they weren't prepared to hear. 2 days after that call, I heard the slam of the front door and the echo of hurried footsteps on the stairs. No introductions were needed. Fury is recognizable before opening the door. Donovan entered first. Brow furrowed, Harlow followed, chin high and lips pressed. "We need to talk," he said. Without greeting, I gestured for them to sit in the living room. On the coffee table, an open folder already awaited them. Calmly, I pulled out the documents one by one, the $25,000 transfer, the hotel receipt from Cape May, the photocopies of the deeds and my accounts. I placed them in front of them like laying pieces on a board. Donovan avoided looking at me. His eyes wandered to the rug, the back of the sofa, anywhere but my face. Harlow, on the other hand, held my gaze with a mix of defiance and disdain. "This is an overreaction," she said. "You're a controlling woman. Beatrice, you don't know how to let your son live his life. You suffocate him, and our marriage along with it." Her words landed with the calculated weight of someone trying to deflect attention. I didn't respond. I simply observed how the tension seeped into their gestures. Donovan's hand fiddling with his ring. Harlow's breathing growing more rapid. "Is that what you think too?" I asked finally. Looking at my son, he swallowed, but didn't answer. The silence among the three of us became dense, almost tangible. I knew that behind the accusation of controlling lay the intent to turn my defense into an unjustified attack. I leaned back on the sofa, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. Outside, a faint murmur from the street contrasted with the silence in the room, and as I watched them, it was clear to me that the facade they'd upheld until then was starting to crack, though I didn't yet know if they'd choose to tear it down themselves or keep propping it up with lies. I took a deep breath before speaking. I had no intention of yelling or arguing. I wanted every word to be etched, with no room for misunderstandings. "From today on," I said, looking first at Donovan and then at Harlow, "things change." I pulled a sheet from the folder and placed it on the table. "Donovan, you'll repay the $25,000 in installments. I don't care if it takes years, but every month I want to see a deposit. It's not just the money, it's respect for the one who gave it to you." Donovan nodded weakly. Without lifting his gaze, Harlow made a scoffing gesture. But I continued, "Harlow, you won't receive any more help or access to any card I pay for. Any expense you make will be with your own money. And one last thing, any dealings with me, whether in word or deed, must be respectful. If not, there will be no dealings at all." She leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Are you threatening us?" "No. I'm setting boundaries. If you don't consider me part of the family, you can live without my support. It's that simple." Silence settled for a few seconds. Then Harlow stood up abruptly, grabbed her purse, and crossed the living room without looking back. The slam echoed through the apartment, vibrating in the walls like an echo of years of unresolved tensions. Donovan remained standing in the doorway, looking at the floor, hands in his pockets. He said nothing, neither did I. Between us there was a new void, different from absence. It was the space of a decision he still wasn't willing to make. Finally, he turned and left, closing the door with a softer gesture than Harlow's, but without looking back. I was left alone in the living room, with the documents still on the table and the feeling of having recovered something more valuable than money control of my life. As I gathered the folders, I thought time would tell which side my son would choose, but I'd already chosen mine. The days following the confrontation were absolute silence. No calls, no messages, no unexpected visits. At first, that void felt strange, almost uncomfortable. Then, it became a relief. I took advantage of that calm to rescue a dream I'd kept in a drawer for decades, opening my own pottery studio. In a corner of the neighborhood, there was a small space with a storefront that had always caught my eye. The rent was affordable, and the location perfect. I signed the lease without consulting anyone. The decision was as much mine as the money backing it. Margot, my lifelong neighbor, offered to help. She'd been an art teacher before retiring, and her enthusiasm was contagious. Together we cleaned, painted, and set up the space. We installed shelves for the pieces, a wheel in the center, and a long table for workshops. The smell of fresh clay mixed with new paint. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was building something for myself. The first clients came out of curiosity. Some wanted to learn. Others sought a place to disconnect from routine. Among them were several single mothers who, over time, began to see me as more than a pottery teacher. They shared their stories while their hands shaped clay, and in their gazes, I found a silent recognition, the knowledge that you can start over without asking permission. I started going out with friends I hadn't seen in years, resumed conversations that didn't revolve around family obligations, and discovered my schedule could fill with my own plans. I stopped checking the phone, hoping to see Donovan's name on the screen. If it came, it would come. And if not, life would go on. Each afternoon, after closing the studio, I'd stay a few minutes in silence, watching the pieces dry on the shelves. There was my work, tangible and solid, the fruit of my decisions. It was during one of those sunsets, with golden light filtering through the storefront, that I heard the bell on the door and saw a familiar shadow cast on the clay floor. 5 months had passed since that last conversation in my living room. The studio was running better than I'd ever imagined, and my days flowed between clay, laughter, and the rhythmic hum of the wheel. One afternoon, while glazing pieces for a large order, the phone began to vibrate. I saw Donovan's name on the screen. I answered. His voice sounded tense. Broken. Mom, we've lost the apartment. The bank has given us a deadline to vacate. I don't know where we're going to go. I stayed silent for a few seconds, listening to the weight of his words. For an instant, compassion brushed me like a warm wind. He was my son, and he was in trouble. But right away, like a lightning bolt illuminating everything, the scenes I'd tried to bury came to me, his complicit silence on Mother's Day, the hidden transfer, the gazes avoiding me while Harlow dictated the course. We need your help, he continued. Anything, even if it's temporary. I didn't respond. I hung up the call without a word. I stared at the phone a few seconds longer, feeling my pulse steady, without the tremor of other times. Then I opened the messaging app and typed slowly, "Only those who really matter." I hit send and set the phone face down on the table. I went to the coat rack, tied on my glaze-stained apron, and returned to the wheel. The damp clay spun under my hands, yielding to each precise pressure, transforming into something new and useful. In that moment, I understood that my life had taken that shape too, molded by my own decisions, without anyone else dictating the design. Outside, the afternoon fell over Philadelphia with a soft light. Inside, the studio was filled with that serene silence I'd fought so hard to conquer. With each turn of the wheel, with each curve shaping the piece, I felt my place in the world was here, intact, far from intrigues and shared accounts. When I finished, I set the piece to dry alongside the others. I observed it for a moment, satisfied, and smiled, realizing that, like that vessel, I too was ready to hold only what was worth it.